So this video is going to be my last one about Jung and Plato, and I'm just going to read a fairly short paper, half an hour or so, 20 minutes, and just to present, kind of wrap it up and describe the traditional view of liberal arts education and a liberal arts educator, and the kind of relationships that young people need in order to grow up to be emotionally mature adults, to educate their eros. And to a lot of great extent, partly because of the Enlightenment, and then for many other reasons, this model of education is a smaller percentage of what goes on in the colleges. I'm not quite sure if the number of people who are subject to it or have the opportunity to get it actually do. I think it's sort of dying. Whether or not it's dying, it doesn't matter. I want to try and keep it alive. I think it's important. I think people need it. I know that I had a professor who was very Socratic, and he had many students over the course of his career who really needed what he had to offer and whose lives are better because of what he gave us. And most importantly, he listened to us. He engaged us in dialogue, and he was totally in love with wisdom, and he triggered the philosophical frenzy. And so I'll talk about it. I'm not very good at triggering it, but I can talk about it. Socrates as a Jungian analyst. In this paper, I will discuss some important comparisons between Jung's description of the activity of an analyst, especially the relationship between an analyst and a client, and Socrates' relationship to his interlocutors. Both the competent Jungian analyst and the competent dialectical teacher must have achieved a high level of self-conscious awareness before they can lead others in that direction. This paper will explain and defend 4 points. First, effective analysts and effective dialectical teachers must know themselves. On both Jung's and Socrates' view, self-knowledge is developed and preserved through an inner dialogue of the soul with itself, which is, in fact, a dialogue between consciousness and what would otherwise be unconscious. Second, because they know themselves, effective analysts and effective dialectical teachers also have insight into other people's characters and motives. Third, effective analysts and effective dialectical teachers act as midwives with those with whom they are speaking, when those with whom they are speaking present ideas to be examined. Fourth, both effective analysts and effective dialectical teachers have the character traits necessary to establish long-term meaningful relationships with other people from many walks of life. Such relationships, often labeled Platonic, are, I submit, the cornerstone of a satisfying life for an individual and the cornerstone for civilized life in any society. An exploration of the relationships between a Jungian analyst and client and Socrates and his interlocutors, therefore, provides a model for the kind of personal and interpersonal life which every human being needs to cultivate in order to have a personally satisfying life and in order to contribute to the quality of life in the broader social and political order. First, Jungian analysts and dialectical teachers must know themselves. This requires an inner dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. Jung defines the unconscious as everything of which I know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking, everything of which I was once conscious but have now forgotten, everything which involuntarily and without paying attention to it I feel, think, remember, want, and do, all the future things that are taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness. Most importantly, the unconscious contains dark instincts which are often repressed or denied, as well as the most profound creative and positive instincts. All instincts, claims Jung, need to be recognized and allowed to play a role in conscious life. Although it might seem counterintuitive at first, recognition of the unconscious will lead consciousness away from absorption in the individual self and toward a more universal and objective understanding of oneself and of the human condition. According to Jung, someone who is dedicated to personal integrity and self-knowledge will renounce the perspective of the personal ego, which only recognizes what it can understand and control, and pay attention to all aspects of the psyche as they express themselves through inner dialogues contrary to the dominant voice of the ego. Quote, thus, in coming to terms with the unconscious, not only is the standpoint of the ego justified, but the unconscious is granted the same authority. The way this can be done is best shown by those cases in which the other voice is more or less directly heard. For such people, it is technically very simple to note down the other voice in writing and to answer the statements from the standpoint of the ego. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings with equal human rights, each of which gives the other credit for a valid argument and considers it worthwhile to modify the conflicting standpoints by means of thorough comparison and discussion, or else to distinguish them clearly from one another. Unquote. Many passages in Plato's dialogues express a similar view. Socrates is often referring to voices he hears, such as the voice of the laws in the Crito dialogue, or the voice in the Phaedo, where he says, a voice told me that was a terrible speech and I'm going to have to stop demonizing Eros. In two other places, Socrates explicitly refers to thought as such, an inner dialogue. In the Theaetetus, Socrates says, quote, now by thinking do you mean the same as I do, a talk which the soul has with itself about the objects under its consideration. Of course, I'm only telling you my idea in all ignorance, but this is the kind of picture I have of it. It seems to me that the soul, when it thinks, is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms and denies. And when it arrives at something definite, either by a gradual process or a sudden leap, when it affirms one thing consistently and without divided counsel, we call this its judgment. Again, in the Sophists, Socrates says, aren't thought and speech the same, except that what we call thought is speech that occurs without the voice, inside the soul in conversation with itself. Unquote. Socrates' ability to ask the right questions, his reputation as a great dialectician, was based on his experience of an inner dialogue with his own soul. Jung would claim that Plato's dialogues are reflections of the inner and outer dialogues which all thoughtful people have with themselves and others, because such dialogues are parts of the collective unconscious, or parts of the human psyche, which are both cultural and inherited. Jung himself had experiences with figures in his imagination who spoke on behalf of the unconscious and functioned as tutors or guides in keeping him aware of repressed or denied aspects of his own psyche. Quote, Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought, for I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Through him the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. He confronted me in an objective manner, and I understood that there is something in me which can say things that I do not know and do not intend, things which may even be directed against me. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. Whenever Socrates is describing inner voices, the voice which speaks to him presents a view which contradicts either his own point of view or the point of view of the conscious ego. In each case, his dialogical confrontation with the inner voice gives him a more objective view of the issue in question. Further, for the reader of Plato, Plato's dialogues as a whole represent the standpoint of superior insight. By studying and internalizing the dialogues within Plato's dialogues, the reader develops an inner dialogue with his or her own unconscious, both in its positive and negative manifestations. This heightened level of conscious awareness enables a person to communicate with others. Jung argues that the ability to understand and communicate with others depends on self-knowledge. Quote, "The present day shows with appalling clarity how little able people are to let the other person's argument count, although this capacity is a fundamental and indispensable condition for any human community. Everyone who proposes to come to terms with himself must reckon with this basic problem. For, to the degree that he does not admit the validity of the other person, he denies the other within himself the right to exist, and vice versa. The capacity for inner dialogue is a touchstone for outer objectivity. The vast majority of people are quite incapable of putting themselves individually into the mind of another. This is indeed a singularly rare art, and, truth to tell, it does not take us very far. Even the person who we think we know best, and who assures us himself that we understand him through and through, is at bottom a stranger to us. He's different. The most we can do, and the best, is to have at least some inkling of his otherness, to respect it, and to guard against the outrageous stupidity of wishing to interpret it." Okay, so this is not only Plato's dialogues, but tragedy and Homer. You have all these people arguing against each other, and they represent inner voices in yourself. You're supposed to empathize, right? Pathos and phobos. You're supposed to identify. You're supposed to be able to think, get in somebody else's shoes, to think outside your box, to imagine being a person in a situation and how you could act violently or overreact. So this is the kind of education, the education for a superior insight that tragedy and Plato were trying to cultivate. And if you think about it, it's amazing that the Greeks had this as public education. This was something they wanted everyone to be exposed to. They wanted as many people as possible to develop this skill, very difficult skill, of integrating repressed and denied ideas and instincts and impulses and bringing them to consciousness and educating them, getting to a higher level where you know you shouldn't act on them. Anyway, in the Charmides dialogue, Socrates discusses the question, what is temperance or self-knowledge? He explains how temperance affects an individual's ability to understand and communicate with others. Quote, "Then only the temperate person will know himself and will be able to examine what he knows and does not know, and in the same way he will be able to inspect other people, to see when a person does in fact know what he knows and thinks he knows, and when again he does not know what he thinks he knows, and no one else will be able to do this. And being temperate and temperance and knowing oneself amount to this, to knowing what one knows and does not know." Unquote. Socrates goes on in the Charmides to explain how individuals with self-knowledge can have a positive effect on society. Quote, "If, as we assumed in the beginning, the temperate person knew what he knew and what he did not know, and that he knows, the former, but not the latter, and were able to investigate another person who was in the same situation, then it would be of the greatest benefit to us to be temperate, because those of us who had temperance would live lives free from error, and so would all those who were under our rule. Neither would we ourselves be attempting to do things we did not understand. Rather, we would find those who did understand and turn the matter over to them. Nor would we trust those over whom we rule to do anything except what they would do correctly, and this would be that of which they possess the science. And thus, by means of temperance, every household would be well run, and every city well governed, and so in every case where temperance reigned, and with error rooted out, and rightness in control, people so circumstanced would necessarily fare admirably and well in all their doings, and, faring well, they would be happy. Unquote. Both Jung and Socrates, therefore, seek self-knowledge, and try to encourage such knowledge in others, because it is a great blessing to individuals and to societies. Again, I want to intervene here and say, ever since 9/11, the political atmosphere gets more and more polarized, and the politicians talk in black and white. They are the good guys, the other guys are the bad guys. They're right, other people are wrong. They know how to do this or that. I mean, they violate this so badly, and they're educating the people to think this way. That's really worrisome to me, is that people are getting educated to think in black and white, to think that they know more than they know. They get rewarded for it. They get emotionally attached to believing they know things they don't know. And this kind of self-knowledge and dialogue and recognition of the other and engagement and recognition of one's own capacity for evil and avoiding projection of the shadow, it's a dying art. It's a dying way to use speech, and it's killing democracy. It's an abuse of free speech to be arrogant and to preach that arrogance to others and to present them with a worldview that flatters them, and then to get elected, to gain power by teaching people to think in a black and white way. And this is the opposite of what the Athenian society was set up to do, and Greek civilization in general. But of course the Athenians corrupted their tradition also, so that's nothing new. It's just that the other way of corrupting it, Critias corrupted it by making everything black and white. And Socrates in the Charmides is actually talking to Critias here, because Critias is trying to figure out self-knowledge, and he defines it as thinking that you know, that you know one thing, and that you do not know, and that you know what you know. And okay, so Critias starts out, I know this, and then he claims to know things he doesn't know. Where Socrates says self-knowledge is knowing what you know and what you don't know, and that you know what you know. So those are totally different if you really think about it. And Socrates represents the person who doesn't claim to know more than he knows, and Critias represents the person who claims to know everything about good and evil and to know a lot more than he knows. And that kind of arrogance and black and white thinking is becoming more and more popular and getting political rewards. People will elect people with that kind of arrogance. So that worries me. Further, both Jung and Socrates use the image of the midwife to describe what they do. Edward Whitmont, summarizing Jung, says, quote, "The therapist consequently finds himself in a new role, which is quite at variance with the traditional image of the knowledgeable psychiatrist who diagnoses and treats a clinical case with sage counsel. He can no longer regard himself as a detached observer who recognizes what is right or normal and advises his patient accordingly. as one who is to aid in the birth of new meaning as unknown and indeed unknowable to him as it is to his patient, the therapist plays a role more nearly that of a midwife or of an experienced senior partner in a common undertaking, a common search. The therapeutic relationship becomes an existential encounter, and indeed Jung felt that if any change is to occur at all, it must touch and affect both participants. And again, I've been doing some research on neuroscience and philosophy, and it worries me that we more and more use drugs to solve people's problems with depression and loss of meaning and purpose, and as opposed to getting into a meaningful dialogue and the kind of midwifery that Jung talks about, and also the educational system, whether it's just the professor professing things and the students writing down what they're supposed to learn and get tested on, or a truly meaningful dialectical relationship. In the Theaetetus dialogue, Socrates also refers to his activity of teaching as a kind of midwifery. The work of midwives is a highly important one. Now, my art of midwifery is just like theirs in most respects. The difference is that I attend men and not women, well, women too, and that I watch over the labor of their souls, not of their bodies. And the most important thing about my art is the ability to apply all possible tests to the offspring, to determine whether the young mind is being delivered of a phantom, that is, an error, or a fertile truth. For one thing which I have in common with the ordinary midwives is that I myself am barren of wisdom. The common reproach against me is that I am always asking questions of other people, but never express my own views about anything, and because there is no wisdom in me. And that is true enough. And the reason of it is this, that God compels me to attend the travail of others, but has forbidden me to procreate, so that I am not in any sense a wise man. I cannot claim as the child of my own soul any discovery worth the name of wisdom. But with those who associate with me, it is different. At first, some of them may give the impression of being ignorant and stupid, but as time goes on and our association continues, all whom God permits are seen to make progress, a progress which is amazing both to other people and to themselves. This is that process of transference and projection that he talked about in the Phaedrus, that the young person is in love and does not know what he loves. So it starts out rather bumbling and works its way up toward a more mature level of dialogue. And yet it is clear that this is not due to anything they've learned from me. It is that they discover within themselves a multitude of beautiful things which they bring forth into the light. But it is I, with God's help, who deliver to them this offspring. And this is this idea that what Socrates represents is a way of life based on the love of wisdom, and which is itself the best life because of the human condition. And so, when people are friends, they mutually love something greater than themselves, and they don't profess anything, and they don't try to control others' thoughts. They try to lead each other and themselves toward a higher level of reflection and understanding. Okay, a proof of this, it is I who deliver to them their offspring. And a proof of this may be seen in the many cases where people who did not realize this fact took all the credit to themselves and thought that I was no good. They've neglected the children I helped them to bring forth and lost them because they set more value upon lies and phantoms than upon the truth. Finally, they have been set down for ignorant fools, both by themselves and by everyone else. Sometimes they come back, wanting my company again, and ready to move heaven and earth to get it. When that happens, in some cases the divine sign that visits me forbids me to associate with them. In others it permits me, and then they begin again to make progress. At times I come across people who do not seem to me somehow to be pregnant. Then I realize that they have no need of me, and with the best will in the world I undertake the business of matchmaking, and I think I'm good enough, God willing, at guessing with whom they might profitably keep company. Okay, so one example of this is Nicias. He likes Socrates, and Nicias thinks he's a big intellectual, and that he examines himself, and he's thought a lot about stuff. But it becomes clear as the dialogue goes on that he is professing things, and he thinks he knows more than he knows. And he has a son who he wants Socrates to be his son's mentor, but Socrates has directed his son to Damon, the music teacher, because I think he knows that that Nicias is somehow getting prestige for identifying with Socrates, and that his son wants to get that same sort of leg up on other people, and that's not a good motive. Of course, later on, it was the opposite. If you associated with Socrates, you're in trouble. But at this point, it was a positive social association, and that shows how Athens declined, and pretty quickly. Okay, in many ways, Socrates' model of teacher as midwife reflects an intellectual version of what Jung would call a spiritually mature soul. First, the intellectual midwife does not either repress or project any of the contents of his or her psyche onto a student. This is not because the person is God and never experiences conflict. Rather, it simply means that when engaged with another person who is pregnant with an idea, the wise person forgets his or her own ideas and simply listens. This is what my teacher used to do. A spiritually mature person can listen and get inside the soul of another person and follow the emotions, ideas, and connections between them of that person. The spiritually mature person, both teacher and analyst, knows how to listen more than anything else. He or she knows that someone who is under the influence of a confused idea needs to project it onto another person and have that person project it back. Or, to put it another way, everyone needs to examine their ideas very carefully with someone she or he can trust. In examining one's ideas, one is examining oneself. The spiritually mature person does not judge the particular person who presents the idea, but examines the idea itself through the categories of the collective unconscious, the categories of truth, justice, and beauty. So this is really important because you don't want it to be an ego conflict. You don't want it to be one opinion battling it out with another. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. That's what the sophists did. They made intellectual life into a boxing match, among other things, or else a performance. And Socrates did not do that. The intellectual midwife stays focused on the idea and does not focus on the person who has the idea. When one finds the idea inadequate, this does reflect upon the person who has the idea, but the person who has the idea must make a choice between identifying with the idea and hence refusing to give up the subjective point of view and the ego associated with that point of view, which would be a phantom delivery, or giving up the subjective ego-driven view of the world in favor of an objective point of view, even if it makes the ego look ignorant or even deluded. By staying focused on the idea, not the person, a conversation with a spiritually mature person is the only way anyone can make the transition from the conscious self-centered ego to the collective unconscious. There are many problems with such a dynamic, however. First, the interlocutor might resent being deprived of his or her subjective point of view and will blame the teacher for the problem. They were in love with their ideas and they couldn't give them up. In these cases, the teacher will be labeled as a bad person or a bad teacher. It's all the teacher's fault. In other cases, the teacher is indeed bad because she or he will project his or her own perspective back onto the student and prevent the student from gaining self-knowledge. If the teacher and student always agree, the teacher will gain a reputation for being wise, but it will not be a justified reputation. If the educational process is based on agreement between teacher and student, then no one learns, and teachers simply create students who grow up to be just like their teachers, but who never go through the painful process of self-examination. In such cases, a teacher creates a group of students who think they know more than they know, because they are disciples of a teacher who thinks he or she knows more than he or she knows. Gorgias, Protagoras, and other sophists are teachers in this sense. In other cases, a teacher will criticize an idea when it is really partially correct. Analytic philosophy are always cutting down the other person. It's not a nurturing kind of training. In such cases, a thoughtful student will be cut off from the study of philosophy because he or she was cut down too soon. This is another way a bad teacher projects his or her ideas and psyche onto a student. The problem again is a failure to listen and then to take an idea and stay focused on the idea, not on the person who presented it. Sometimes the person who comes to a teacher or analyst is almost incoherent. He or she is in a state of inner conflict. It's difficult for a teacher to tell if the cause of this conflict is an inflated ego, which finally realizes the limits of its own importance, or if it's the opposite problem, a person who is trying desperately to gain an objective frame of reference from which to understand human life, and simply cannot find the language to express this deep need and desire. The teacher should be able to figure out the cause fairly easily. But the student who is struggling to gain insight is in a psychologically precarious position. The unconscious is coming into consciousness. It wants to be integrated into the conscious mind. The person's psyche is seeking wholeness, but it's a long and difficult process. It's a rare person, whether teacher, analyst, or mentor, who can play the role of midwife whenever necessary and can play it well. Every society needs spiritually mature adults in any walk of life who act as spiritual and intellectual midwives, who seek the higher perspective and who take the time and effort to help those who also seek self-knowledge and insight. Further, this kind of relationship, whether it occurs formally as a teacher-student, analyst-client, or mentor-mentee relationship, is also a good model for long-term, meaningful friendships. The difference is that a friend is someone who has gone through the process and sees the world and human experience from an objective point of view. This explains why Socrates emphasizes in many Platonic dialogues how much he values friendship. In the Lysis, an entire dialogue on friendship, Socrates says, "Ever since I was a boy, there's a certain thing I've always wanted to possess. You know how it is, everybody's different. One person wants to own horses, another dogs, another wants money, and another fame. Well, I'm pretty lukewarm about those things, but when it comes to having friends, I'm absolutely passionate, and I would rather have a good friend than the best quail or gamecock known to man. There's no doubt in my mind, by the dog, that I would rather possess a friend than all Darius' gold, or even than Darius himself. That's how much I value friends and companions." And I understand that. If the philosopher-analyst is indeed a person who has an objective point of view, then it is reasonable to think that such a person would want friends and would be able to be the friend of other good people. Anyone who takes the objective point of view will feel alone and lonely without someone else with whom to converse. Such people won't complain if there's no one else around, but they will certainly try to find others with whom to converse, partly because they need to test their views against the views of others, and partly because they need to keep expanding and applying their point of view to the situations around them. Such a person would direct conversations toward the truth. Friends engaged in such conversations would not mind being corrected if the correction truly came from the objective point of view. But the goal would be to develop a point of view which is deeper, more true, more just, and more beautiful than one can find in the daily activities of the subjective psyche. It's a mutual search for meaning with another person who's on the same search. Such relationships are based on the desire to know and the need for meaning. They're the cornerstone of a truly civilized life. They are what make human life worth living and what promote social well-being more than any particular body of laws or social institutions. Without self-knowledge and meaningful friendships, a society cannot function efficiently, and cannot provide its citizens with an emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually satisfying life. The models of the Jungian analyst and the Socratic teacher, therefore, are important archetypes toward which every human being who wants to live a meaningful life should strive to imitate. Further, Plato's dialogues are a unique form of literature which attempts to express the inner dialogue of the collective unconscious with consciousness, as well as being general examples of the most meaningful conversations we can have with others. So that's an important idea of the individuated person. So I wanted to quote a little bit more about Jung, from Jung, about the model in all the world's major mythological traditions of the person who really has integrity. The common occurrence, there's a common occurrence in art of the image of the cosmic person. Quote, it manifests itself as a gigantic symbolic human being who embraces and contains the whole cosmos. Unquote. Jung believes this is a projection of the completely individuated soul. Quote, the whole inner psychic reality of each individual is ultimately oriented toward this archetypal symbol of the self. Unquote. In his image and speech of the wisest human being, Plato portrays Socrates as one type of cosmic person. For Plato, the universe is governed by a divine mind. Quote, mind, the ruling power, persuaded necessity to bring the greater part of created things to perfection, and thus and after this manner in the beginning, through necessity, made subject to reason, this universe was created. So there's the activity of the things, the regularities in the universe, patterns that don't change, and then creativity and bringing things to birth. Human beings are born with the potential for living a life governed by mind, but it requires a long process of education and nurture. Quote, the soul, when encased in a mortal body, is at first without intelligence. All it has is the potential for intelligence. But when the flood of growth and nutriment abates, and the courses of the soul, calming down, go their own way and become steadier, he attains the fullness and health of the perfect person. But if he neglects education, he walks lame to the end of his life, and returns imperfect and good for nothing to the world below. Unquote. Socrates is presented as a person whose soul is governed by intelligence or mind. His life is a microcosm in a universe governed by the same force, mind. Socrates is also an educator who's willing to help anyone in the process of development, from potentially leading the life of the mind to actually doing so. This includes shadow, animus anima, and consciousness. In Jung's term, Socrates was an individuated person who encouraged others to know themselves and become individuated also.